FYI, we're going to be recording, and we're going to be live on Facebook as well, if anybody wants to join us from there. Again, thank you so much for joining, and we hope you find this event thought-provoking. I'm going to leave the stage to Alessandro, who is going to introduce our two speakers.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for participating and tuning in. So, good afternoon for those in our time zone, and welcome. It is my distinct pleasure to present our speakers who will converse on a theme very dear to Centro Primo Levi, the life and work of the 19th century rabbi and philosopher Elia Benamozegh from the port city of Livorno. The occasion of this talk is Clémence Boulouque's new book entitled Another Modernity, Elia Benamozegh's Jewish Universalism, published by Stanford University Press. Another Modernity is a study of Benamozegh, whose work profoundly influenced Christian-Jewish dialogue in 20th century Europe. Benamozegh, an Italian rabbi of Moroccan descent, and we'll discuss a little bit more in detail his specific milieu, was a prolific writer and transnational thinker who corresponded widely with religious and intellectual figures in France, North Africa, and the Middle East. The book shows him brilliantly negotiating his cosmopolitanism within the specific microcosm of Livorno's Sephardic life. Benamozegh was also Italy's most articulate proponent of Kabbalah, at a time when Jewish mysticism was widely disdained. In Gershom Scholem's opinion, he and Franz Molitor were the only two scholars of the age to approach the Kabbalah out of a fundamental sympathy, even affinity, for its teachings. What Benamozegh proposed was unprecedented, that the Jewish tradition presents a solution to the religious crisis of modernity, and further, but it was uniquely equipped to mediate the tensions between religion and reason. In her book, Boulouque presents an investigation in Benamozegh's published and unpublished works and his continuing legacy. We will hear about this later, but I must say that while growing up, I always heard from elders their lamentation on how in contemporary Jewish debates, Benamozegh had been marginalized, if not forgotten. So I'm especially eager to hear about his enduring legacy. Clémence Boulouque is an assistant professor of Jewish and Israeli studies at Columbia University. Her wide interests span from Jewish thought and mysticism to interreligious encounters and intellectual history. I will not take more time with her bibliography, readily available online, but what I will say is that before delving into Jewish studies, she had a brilliant career in France as a writer, journalist, and literary critic. It is a pleasure to have her with us. Jessica Marglin is Associate Professor of Religion, Law, and History, and the Ruth Ziegler Early Career Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. Among other works, she is the author of Across Legal Lines, Jews and Muslims in Modern Morocco from 2016. So welcome to you both and to our audience. Without further ado, we will start with Jessica talking a bit about the book, and then they will engage in a conversation. Thank you so much. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Alessandro and Sophia, Natalia, for setting this up, and Clémence, mainly thanks to you for having written this wonderful book. It's such a treat, really, especially in these times of isolation, continued isolation, although hopefully it's, as we were speaking about just before the webinar started, hopefully it's getting better, but still, it's really such a pleasure to be able to engage in this kind of conversation. And I'll just say to everybody who is participating, my main task tonight is really not to do anything except to get Clémence to speak as only she can on Benamozegh and on her really truly brilliant and path-breaking interpretation of him. So I really think you're all in for a treat. This is a marvelous book, and I'll show it off as a kind of show and tell for those of you who haven't seen it. I'll just say that, you know, as happy as I am to be able to do this on Zoom, I think there is something lost when we can't all sit in a room together. And I particularly somehow being here with you, Clémence, and holding your book, and, you know, sort of, it's still so new. It makes me think of the tradition in French seminars of always, whenever you discuss a book, you pass it around and everybody in the seminar just kind of gets to rifle through it and look at it and touch it. And there's something so tactile about that, which somehow I'm missing particularly today. So I just want to start with just really some very brief reflections on another modernity and on Clémence's interpretation of Benamozegh and explication of Benamozegh, and then I'll ask you, Clémence, some questions just to sort of start off a conversation between you and me. And then for those of you who are attending in the audience, I really do hope that you will send in questions via the Q&A, and then we will leave ample time for a broader discussion, because of course that's the most interesting part, when we can all kind of engage. So I'll just say a little bit about maybe why I'm here today, how I first got interested in Benamozegh, and then through that sort of met Clémence and got to know her work a little bit. I'm not an intellectual historian, and I'm not a scholar of Jewish thought, modern or otherwise. I'm really more of a social and legal historian, and I'm interested in Jews in modern North Africa and the Mediterranean. And I stumbled across Benamozegh when I was working on another project, which eventually led to this book that I'm finishing now. And I stumbled upon him, first of all, as a printer, not as a brilliant philosopher, not as a thinker, but as somebody who was so active in the printing of books, particularly books authored by North African Jews. Now, you know, for those of you who aren't as steeped in North African Jewish history as Clémence, North Africa and most of the Middle East through at least the mid-19th century did not have their own printing presses. So even though Jewish scholars were incredibly active and produced enormous amounts of material, if they wanted to get them printed, they had to go elsewhere. And there were various centers of Hebrew printing in Europe, and at first in the Middle East, at first like in Istanbul and Salonika, but then eventually those kind of shut down. Eventually, Italy really became by far one of the most important centers of Hebrew printing for Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. And eventually, not even, you know, there were various centers in Italy. Venice was a big one, but by the late 18th, early 19th century, Livorno had really taken pride of place. And amongst the Livornese Hebrew printers, of whom there were many, Benamozegh was in some ways the most active as a printer, kind of catering to these North African and Middle Eastern Jewish scholars and readers. And I, you know, was working on a project on a sort of Algerian Moroccan rabbi who printed a number of his works with Benamozegh, and, you know, who got into a lot of trouble, because of course historians are always interested in people who get into trouble. And I was curious about this Benamozegh, and I was trying to find out information about him. And this was, I think, Clémence, I think this was when you were still finishing your dissertation, right? This was before you'd even defended.
I started writing the first.
You were writing, but I don't think you were finished. And I was sort of looking around desperately for information about Benamozegh, and, you know, there are some good books. Alessandro Guetta's book is very important, but there was almost nothing about him as a person, right? It was all about his thought. It was all about his philosophy. And I remember when somehow somebody put us in touch, Clémence, it was like, you know, the gates of heaven opening, because you knew all about him. You knew everything I wanted to know. And I was so, you know, I was so pleased to have met somebody who kind of recognized him not just as this really interesting thinker, but as this Mediterranean figure, as somebody connecting North Africa, the Middle East, Italy, and really the rest of Europe, actually. I mean, in some ways, what is so amazing about Benamozegh, and you show this very well in your book, is that he reflects the extent to which Livorno itself was a node in this broader Jewish Mediterranean world, right? Not just intellectually, but also in terms of printing, and also in terms of commerce and all of that. So one of the things that, I think is so wonderful about your book is precisely that you devote a number of chapters at the beginning to the kind of, I think you call it the contexts of Benamozegh, and you talk about his Moroccan heritage, you talk about his studying with his uncle, who was a Moroccan Kabbalist, you talk about his involvement in the Risorgimento, you talk about his kind of branching out into this French readership. We talk about him as a publisher, of course, as well, and your work is very pathbreaking in that sense. And again, I think as a primarily social historian, that kind of context is so welcome, but also I think so important for intellectual history, actually. And I think that increasingly intellectual historians are recognizing the extent to which one has to situate a thinker, not just in the thought, but in the world that he or she comes from. But of course, the main thrust of your book, and so much of its sort of interest and import is how beautifully you tease out the different strands of Benamozegh's thought in a way that really hasn't been done before. And there's a lot to be said about this, and I don't want to say most of it. I want to let you say most of it, but I'll just say some of what I think is so remarkable about the book is the ways in which you kind of persistently but gracefully and even elegantly break down the dichotomies that so often structure the way we think about Judaism in particular, or more broadly, really about religion, particularly in the modern age. So, one of them, I think, is this dichotomy between rationalism and mysticism, and Alessandro already mentioned this in his introduction, right? This idea that they are opposed, and that one is either a mystic or a rationalist, and that you have to kind of choose a camp, almost like a football team, which of course we know at some level to be suspicious of, but in Benamozegh's work and in your explication of it, you show the extent to which that is just ridiculous, really, right? Completely unhelpful, and not at all how Benamozegh himself thought about his approach to religion, to marrying philosophy with mysticism, and not at all what he thought mysticism was all about. I think you also do a similar thing for this dichotomy of tradition and modernity. You rightfully sort of critique the Weberian opposition between those two terms that like Jacob Katz's tradition and crisis, right? There is this idea that there was tradition and now there's modernity, and it's this disruptive thing. And rather, you talk about the ways in which Benamozegh, who was avowedly Orthodox, who was very steeped in what we might call a kind of traditional Jewish world of text and education, how he was absolutely committed to a modern Judaism, Jewish modernity, as you call it, and to explicating a version of Judaism that would be relevant for the modern age. And that brings me to the last thing I want to say, which is just, I think, something really that I'll just sort of gesture towards, and then I hope it will come out very much in our conversation, which is just the extent to which Benamozegh's ideas are so urgent now for our present day, that so much of what he talks about is so important in helping us think through some of the conundrums and difficulties and questions that really, I think, are, among the most pressing questions that we have today, not just as scholars of Judaism or Jewish thought or scholars of religion, but as people, as citizens of the world, as people living in a diverse place where there is particularism and where we often aspire to a certain universalism. And so I just want to say that, in closing, that so much of what you've done is you've brought Benamozegh out of a truly undeserved obscurity, right? He's not generally placed in the canon of modern Jewish thought. Hopefully people will read your book and they'll change their mind. And now there is this incredibly well-written, accessible, erudite sort of overview, introduction of explication of situating, of contextualization of his thought that I think will change the way, the map of modern Jewish thought and modern Jewish studies. So with that, I don't want to speak for much longer, because mostly I want this to be about Clémence getting to tell everybody here who's in attendance about a little bit about the book and kind of whet your appetite. And I do hope many of you, if you haven't already, will read it. And I just want to start with really, I mean, this is almost a selfish question, and I think it's a question that scholars often like to ask, but hey, I'm asking the question, so I get to ask it. I just want to hear a little bit about the genesis of this project for you, Clémence. How did you come to Benamozegh? What was it about Benamozegh that grabbed you? And yeah, how did it all start?
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. First of all, it's such a pleasure to be here, whatever here is this day in this virtual space. But, you know, this is also how, you know, we connect through time as historian, I guess, and through places. Thank you so much to Alessandro, Natalia, and Sophia for, you know, putting this together and giving us a space to talk about this. Yeah, obscure figure. I mean, Benamozegh is a lesser known character. And this is, you know, when I was writing my dissertation, people sometimes would be suspicious of why would I even, you know, dedicate so much of my time in this, you know, in my doctoral efforts to this figure. So Alessandro in the introduction mentioned that I have this background in France. So basically I'm a recovering literary critic or journalist, whatever you want to call this. But I was also very much brought up in this environment of French secularism in which religion gets a bad name, right? And so the very notion that religious figures would be so passionate about building bridges, about redefining modernity, in which those binaries that you know, mentioned, Jessica, would be irrelevant or would be proven wrong. And so that's one of the aspects of Benamozegh thought, saying that if we do operate, if we do think along those binaries, those dichotomies of religion, modernity, science and religion, faith and science, this is only going to deepen the existential or spiritual crisis that he saw sort of shaping up in the 19th century. As you mentioned, he's a child of the Risorgimento, but he's also a child of, you know, the child of the century who witnessed this kind of really conservative turn, not to say, you know, reactionary, of the Pope, the syllabus of errors, the notion that modernity has to be, is a kind of heresy. And so this is something that he also experienced firsthand when he published this biblical commentary, where he put in dialogue science, philosophy, and the Pentateuch. And the Aleppo rabbis had this really very unprecedented gesture of burning and banning this commentary for the audacity of trying to show that the Bible was actually in dialogue with its time and that it was still in dialogue with our time. So when you mentioned the importance of providing context, somehow I'm probably also mimicking Benamozegh's you know, impetus for providing and giving context so that the religion, whichever religion we're talking about, is actually not something that is detached, but that is almost a cultural criticism and commentary. And so that's something that I find to be very relevant. The notion also that the more universal a religion is, means that it has to be very particular. So that is something that, you know, Levinas sort of picked up on, although he never really acknowledged Benamozegh's influence. I think that in the book, I'm sort of trying to show that there might be points of contact between the two, or at least that Levinas was aware of the work of Benamozegh. But this is also a way in which we sort of reassess the role that religion might play, not just as, you know, it's not a ritualistic approach. It's almost this kind of philosophical way of thinking about metaphysics in a religious, you know, from a religious perspective. And this is, you know, really the impetus of Benamozegh when he wrote Israel and Humanity, his posthumous work that was published in, so posthumously in 1914, but was that he was still working on when he died in 1900, was to say, well, you know, if we do away with religion, then all the metaphysical appetites of human beings are going to be lessened. And there is, and then, you know, beauty, the arts that he was so fond of, I mean, he quotes Dante all the time, are also going to suffer. And there is, in his defense of religion, he's also envisioning, and again, like he's also a man of his time, so there is some blind, you know, some aspects to his thought, but he really think of how religion can lead to not a more perfect union, but a good society. And when I was joking about the more perfect union is that he really thinks about connections and how you can articulate the Judaism with other religions, that idea that there's almost something of a scientific discourse in his work. Again, like because religion and science shouldn't be separated in his understanding, in which the world is like cells, and you really have to you know, make them work, otherwise it is cancerous, and there is the risk of really devolving into the kind of condemnation of modernity that he saw in the Vatican happen. That's something that he really cautioned against. And that's also why he also switched to French, so that he could make his voice heard and you know, like really give a diagnosis of his times. So that is you know, like the sort of the personal you know, quest for not, I don't want to say alternative discourse, but maybe a counter narrative in which you know, there is no, those oppositions are revisited, and that people of his time, I mean, really now this, you know, questioning the Weberian dichotomies is something that is almost taken for granted, but he was already doing this in the 1970s and onwards, so.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, well, I think first of all, you know, there's a difference between what's taken for granted amongst scholars of religious studies and what's taken for granted more broadly. And I think, you know, what you put it so nicely, that kind of mutual demonization of religion and modernity, right? That the modernists portray religion as this evil influence that's kind of the root of all the bad things in the world, and the reactionary religious people like the Pope eyes, you know, it's the opposite. It's the modernists, it's the secularists who are the cause of all evils, and this comes up all the time still. You know, this is not this conversation is not over, even if scholars think that they've broken down these binaries. It really isn't, and it is. It's amazing that somebody like Benamozegh already could see the problem with this opposition and was already trying to fight against it and was already trying to articulate a different path. It really is incredible. There's so much to say about everything that you've kind of started us off. And you gave us a lovely sort of, I think, précis of some of the most important interventions that you make in the book. But I actually, in some ways, because we're at the Centro Primo Levi, I want to start with a question about Italy and about, you know, I said a little bit about, very briefly about Benamozegh's involvement in the Risorgimento, and if you'd like, you know, we could talk a little bit more about his sort of biography and his rootedness in Livorno, which he never left. It's also, I think, helpful for times of isolation and not going many places, that people can have these incredibly rich intellectual lives, staying in the same place all the time.
And without Zoom, like, can you imagine?
And no Zoom, exactly, just letters. Absolutely. So it's very inspiring. But I think I personally, and again, maybe, you know, this is all just self-serving questions, but I would love to hear you say a little bit more about sort of situating Benamozegh and your work on Benamozegh more broadly in Italian Jewish history, and maybe how his Italianness, or how the Italian perspective, one might say, can change the way we think about Jews and Judaism more broadly.
Right. So in order to, I mean, this is such an important question. I think that Benamozegh would not be Benamozegh without not just Italy, but Livorno. So the idea of his main argument is basically that there is a need and a possibility of finding interreligious dialogue if you go back to the roots of Judaism and to really creating this religious unity, and Judaism has a specific role to play. So as opposed to the discourse of his time that was very much, either in France or in Germany, that looked at, so you had this anti-Jewish tropes about this specificity of Judaism that was not able to engage with the world. And you also had, Reform Judaism that said, well, we have to do away with part of the tradition because there is no way there can be any kind of emancipation. And Benamozegh, from his Italian Moroccan perspective, said, well, hold on a second. This is not the way. You cannot just, censor part of the tradition so that it works with the contemporary, conundrums. So which brings me to the importance of Elia. That's something, the idea that it doesn't have to be either or. That Judaism is almost like a connective tissue. Or he also mentions Kabbalah as a connecting shape, right? Something that brings various religions and various faiths together. And which is a possibility of coexistence. But that very coexistence really goes back to his upbringing and the fact that he never left Livorno, actually. There is some sort of discussion whether he went to Florence, which is like maybe 2 hours away, but that's the amount of it. But Livorno is this place where, Lois Dubin coined the word, the poor Jews, a place in which there were cultural exchanges. There was never a ghetto. I mean, this is a result of the ambition of the Medici, bringing people for commercial purposes, right? But bringing people to this free port so that, there could be some commercial expansion. But for those people to be, lured or enticed to come to Livorno, there also had to be provisions for religious freedom. And then, Livorno became this place where, so there was never a ghetto, there was no Inquisition, there was freedom of worship. And that created this cosmopolitan identity. So, there has been literature written about the fact that maybe we should not sort of read too much into it. Like Livorno was not New York City. Like, there is certain limits to what cosmopolitanism would have looked like. But there was certainly not this idea that communities should be completely separated. In the 17th, 18th century, you also have, libraries and salons in which Jews and Christians would, again, it's like the elite. I'm not saying that lay people would engage in that kind of intellectual and religious conversations, but there is really this, what Momigliano called the oasis. And that is very important. I think that left a mark on what Benamozegh envisioned as a place of coexistence. So you could sort of, Livorno could be this microcosm that could be expanded. And then there is the Moroccan identity. So as you mentioned, Livorno was a place in which books were printed, but those cultural exchanges actually were a result of commercial exchanges. And so that became a hub in which rabbis would come for a certain amount of time from North Africa, from also the Eastern Mediterranean. And that created a place in which those North African traditions, for instance, especially in the case of Benamozegh, whose family came from Morocco, in which there is a specific way of dealing with Kabbalah. And that also makes a huge difference, because the disdain or the contempt that mysticism was greeted with in the Enlightenment in, say, Germany. You think of Salomon Maimon and a number of people who were Wissenschaftler or Maskilim, people who were really advocates of the Jewish Enlightenment. That's something that Benamozegh rejected wholeheartedly. I mean, this is, for him, this is a moment where Judaism loses itself, because it is not able to see this, the potential that Kabbalah has to actually capture the essence of spiritual appetites of humanity. He talks about Kabbalah as a collective unconscious. You know, he's also writing at a moment where the notion of the unconscious emerges, you know, really takes Europe by storm with the work of von Hartmann, and he was really steeped in all this kind of conversation, and he really feels that if you're able to go back to mysticism, the mystical roots of religions, then you find a sort of common language, a common stock of images through which you will be able to, by going back, going forward. It's really like looking inward to look outward. And that's a reason why he's so adamant that Kabbalah should be reassessed and repurposed for in order to create the conditions of fruitful but also challenging engagement. I mean, I'm not sugarcoating the fact that sometimes Benamozegh's writings were, to say the least, a little convoluted, and also there is this not just because he switched from Italian to French, and at times it's better to sort of know Italian a little bit so that you can orient yourself in what he was writing in French, but also there is something about his desire to reach a broader audience, and that's in translating Kabbalah to a broader audience. Sometimes he's a little abrasive or like really scathing with people who are not necessarily Kabbalah friendly, or also or who he envisions as you know, enemies, like almost enemies of how do you sorry, I'm just blanking, but enemies of a right way to castigate the brother who erred, right? So there's he basically, and that's something that was problematic in his style, right? When he says, well, you know, I'm just imparting some truth, and truth sometimes hurts a little bit, but that's because we're brothers, or that's because we're cousins. And so there's also, that's something that I'm talking about in the book, like this self-assertion that is part of Jewish modernity. Like he is writing, you could say that he's writing Jewish apologetics, that he's trying to make a case for the importance of Judaism in the modern world, but he's also very unapologetic in the way in which he's talking about, you know, the Judaism's mission to the nations, and also the way in which, for instance, he characterizes the apostles as failed Kabbalists. So basically, Jesus was a Kabbalist, and his disciples were not educated enough nor sophisticated enough to understand that he was speaking Kabbalistic metaphors. And so, you know, you can imagine that would rub, you know, Christians the wrong way. And at a certain point, he was actually he submitted an essay with the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and he only got second prize because the rabbis were a little, you know, uncomfortable with giving a first prize because they felt that, you know, that would be seen as too scathing to their, you know, a Catholic audience. And so Benamozegh was absolutely outraged, saying, well, you know, we can have heated conversations. That is part of, you know, what dialogues should be like. And so that's another reason when we're talking about his relative obscurity, I think that there is a certain tone that when you're trying to promote interreligious encounters seem to be a little off. And so, I mean, one needs to go past it, but certainly at the time that didn't happen, or that happened only was well received by church reformists. So people were already ready to, or willing to hear how to best, you know, change course or reorient Christian thinking. But that was, you know, there is the ecumenical tone that's lacking, even though the context are suddenly really trying to be inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, he's unapologetic.
Right.
Benamozegh, he does not pull any punches at that, and it can be refreshing, actually, I think, sometimes to read about somebody who was so just, this is what I think, it wasn't clearly not concerned too much about offending.
Yeah, but I mean, one of is the sort of the contradictions, because he's also someone who realizes the power of the media at the time. Like, he's really someone who envisions a role of public intellectual for a rabbi, for religious people. And he had this, he entered the contest about, for the theme was the crime of war denounced to humanity. Right. And so he's really, we lost the submission that was 150 page long, because, brevity was not necessarily one of his forte. And so, but we do have the minutes of the jury, the committee, that really lamented the fact that at times was a little, really overwhelming, because he did have a number of really amazing insights. And especially in his attempt to outlaw war, which basically anticipates the League of Nations by 20 years or 50 years, he was he really relied clearly. I mean, we have the outline of what he wrote. So he relied on the media, on magazines, and journalism, and like really being a public intellectual. So that's another way in which, if modernity is also about finding public and spaces in which there can be those conversations, this is a way in which religious figures can be modern.
This is, I think, a really good segue to ask you, because you've talked already a lot about mysticism and about his approach to mysticism, which is in many ways sort of, at the heart of what is so innovative about his thought. And I think perhaps, to my mind, one of the most, again, sort of delightfully unexpected juxtapositions of his philosophy is precisely that for Benamozegh, it is the particularism of mysticism that is the core of Jewish universalism, right? So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more precisely about Benamozegh's universalism as rooted in particularism. You already sort of spoke, you gestured a little bit towards this, but I think it would be worth explicating a little bit more what he meant by that, and maybe why it shouldn't be so almost oxymoronic to have this particularist universalism, if you're willing to go that far.
So I, again, by way of situating him, I think that the notion that something can be grounded and within a particular community and still have a message, carry a message that resonates beyond this community, is something that he learned from his Italian background. Like, you see early on, when he was a young preacher at the time of the Risorgimento, he said, well, the more Italy has something to teach the world, and Judaism also has something to teach the world. So he's really taking pride of being both the heir of Dante and Moses. So this is one of his ways of bringing together different traditions and showing how Judaism, Jewish identity and Italian identity should not be pitted against one another. So that's that first way of really showing the ethical message, the ethical worth of those belongings. And that's something that he kept on articulating throughout his life and career. And so when he's talking about this universalism, basically he's showing that the ethical message of Judaism goes beyond the mitzvot, or that's something that has value in order to build this world that I'm talking about, this world of modernity, in which even if you're as a secular society should learn from what has from this ethical or moral values. So he's really, and he's also sort of revisiting the notion that it's, that's a Christian message, it's Christian love. That's something that is not sort of satisfied with. The other aspect of this universalism is also in the idea of humanity, right? So he's writing at a time in which science is trying to show that, racism, scientific racism, and its political uses are on the rise. And you have this idea that actually, various races can be explained and like chalked down to the fact that there are multiple, origins. So that's the Adamite theory. And he's actually bringing, coming up with another narrative saying, well, in Jewish mysticism, and mysticism in general, Adam, the figure of Adam, really shows that there is one ancestor, right? And that this one ancestor, whether it's mythical, whether it's historical, that doesn't matter. And this is really this moment of genius where he's saying, if there is a myth, that means that there is a consciousness, a collective consciousness that can create the narrative, that can build this feeling of belonging. And so that's something that he takes from Vico, the idea that when you're looking at the text, you shouldn't be just looking at what the text said, but also this kind of the intention. What is the text trying to tell us? And that's why, this humanity that is actually this aggregate of various, multitude of people, he's also talking of the 70 languages spoken at Sinai and the necessity of having this diversity. But that is actually summed up in this mythical figure, or that's, gathered this mythical figure of Adam. And that Kabbalah really has, thought, and is, brims with, interpretations of Adam. That is Benamozegh's universalism. One of those aspects is also really emphasizing the importance of the Noahide laws, which are this 7 moral laws that are that bind humanity. So you have the 613 mitzvot for Jews, but you also do have, Judaism, the core of Judaism also has this possibility of finding a core set of laws that reflects important values. And so that was seen as this kind of natural law in the Enlightenment. And Benamozegh is not happy with it. He's saying, well, no, that's just a way in which all those various people can be brought together. And that sort of, it's almost like an accordion, right? So you have, like 313 mitzvot, you have 7, and that shouldn't mean necessarily that there is a sort of hierarchy. If God loves his people for them and gives them mitzvot, so that means that he has a preference for Jews. And so that's something that Benamozegh really never is comfortable with. But that's another part of Judaism. So the idea that, Jewish law is actually very ethnocentric and that makes no space for the non-Jews is something that he rejects completely. He talks about also the facts that, about the way in which there was a space for non-Jews in the Jerusalem temple. He's really interested in those places that, are still on the, that's not Judaism itself, right? But Judaism makes space for a theology of the other. And that's also very important. That's not something that you find all that much in Judaism. Like Christianity had to make space for a theology of the other because, reclaiming the Old Testament or the only testament for the Jews, right? But it is part of this DNA. Judaism never really had to do so. Historically, you had to engage with Christians, but that's not part of it's not a core aspect of the theology. And so Benamozegh actually revisits this and makes space for thinking about the other. And it's really, I think that really this theology of other religions also is a significant aspect of his thought. because once you're able to think about the other as someone or something that complements, and that is almost a necessity for this religion, or that creates this kind of interaction that you mentioned. I mean, this idea of interdependence is also very, very important. And when you mention, you know, reading the book in times of COVID and pandemic, I mean, we are also, I mean, like, in case we didn't know it, like, we were made acutely aware of this, you know, this interdependence. And I mean, that's something that Benamozegh thought about, not just, you know, not big from an epidemiologist point of view, but like from the theology of this necessity of the other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I actually want to stick with the theme of the present, because I think one of the things that's really remarkable and particularly successful about your book is the way that you tease out the afterlives of Benamozegh's thought. And you say in your introduction that, you know, part of this is because maybe his most important work was published posthumously. So there's a way in which the echoes of his thought can only really be grasped after his death and sometimes long after his death. But also, I think one of the things that you note is that there's such a unexpected range of different thinkers and political operatives who sort of latch on to some of Benamozegh's ideas. So I have two questions about that. One, I think it would be helpful for people in the audience just to hear you talk a little bit about some of that range, you know, religious Zionists, evangelical Christians, Levinas, et cetera. You've already mentioned Levinas a little bit, but perhaps just to give a sense of how Benamozegh's ideas have popped up again, often in the second half of the 20th century and in these very incongruent places. But then also, I'm curious more from a kind of researcher methodological perspective, how did you decide to work on these afterlives or these echoes of Benamozegh's thought, and how did you come to them? Did you know that Benamozegh was somebody that you wanted to trace into the 21st century, or did you stumble upon it, or is it, you know, did it somehow sort of impose itself on you in some way as a scholar?
Yeah, so thanks for also mentioning this, the importance of what, you know, those afterlives of Benamozegh. I mean, that is part of the paradoxes, and somehow someone, you know, Shaul Magid said, well, that's a noble failure, right? That's an instance of someone whose ideas were, you know, somehow maybe misunderstood or used in a certain way according to a pre-existing agenda. And so for someone who was interested in looking at those bridge builders of, you know, how to create interreligious, the possibility of coexistence, that was painful, right? So I'll just trace those genealogies, so I mean, or those legacies, those testaments so that people get a better sense of what I'm talking about. But so basically, Benamozegh wrote Israel and Humanity, his 1900 page posthumous, I mean, that became posthumous work. He had a Christian disciple, someone who was eager to convert to Judaism, who started correspondence with Benamozegh, visited him twice in Livorno. And Benamozegh discouraged him to convert and said, well, you know, what we need is really someone who would be a messenger of the urgency of the Noahide laws in order to create this, the conditions or for religious coexistence, and really showing this core identity of many religions. So Pallière, who was, you know, almost became a priest, sort of decided not to convert. And there's also something very touching, because Benamozegh thought that, you know, there's an emotional aspect to religion, and Pallière thought that his mother would be extremely sad should he convert. So there's always this emotional aspect of religion that both took into account. But he was asked after the death of Benamozegh by Benamozegh's son, Emanuele, and the rabbis of Livorno to take care of this 1900-page manuscript. originally, Pallière also suggested Benamozegh that maybe a little editing of the works that he published in French would, not be amiss. And because Benamozegh really realized that he was not exactly reaching the audience that he was hoping to reach. And so Benamozegh sort of conveyed the idea that, a little editing, Frenching would be better. And so that took him 14 years. And from 1900 pages, it went down to 700 pages, the 1914 edition. And then after the war, there was an abridged edition. But that created the possibility of suspicion that Pallière actually probably came with this Christian baggage, and that it was not steeped in Judaism enough to be able to get the subtleties of the Jewish mystical concept that Benamozegh was trying to convey. So the 1900-page manuscript was again turned to 700 pages, and I got a chance to, well, actually, I took 1900 pictures of the text and I compared the two versions. So the idea that Pallière Christianized Benamozegh's text is ill-founded. So from that moment on, you had a number of people who followed Pallière and who were actually very influenced by him. He was, so he became the voice of Benamozegh's attempt to promote a new understanding of Christianity. And so, as I mentioned, church reformists around at the end of the turn of the 20th century were very eager to use Benamozegh's concept and really try to have Christianity go back to its roots in order to not, following the steps of the syllabus of errors of that kind of very reactionary turn that the church had taken. So you have this, a number of such thinkers. At the same time, it was also very influential through Pallière. There was this generation called l'École de Paris that was really eager to also show the worth of Judaism as through its universalism, right? So showing the ethical value and what's called the Jewish Renaissance, and after the war, that was also the case. So you have people, a number of thinkers on which Benamozegh exerted this really great influence, to the extent that some of them were invited to participate in the Second Vatican Council. And so you can see in this effort to define what the common grounds, echoes of Benamozegh thought. And some of those thinkers were really reclaiming Benamozegh's legacy, to the extent that a number of very right-wing, conspiracy theories, the people of conspiracy theories saw Benamozegh and Pallière Judaizing the church, right? Then the Second Vatican Council was a result of this Jewish conspiracy that was meant to strip Christianity of its Christian identity. And you see this, it's still up on the internet, among other praises of Donald Trump. And you can see the kind of language that they're using. So that's the part of an inclusive understanding of Benamozegh, promoters of interreligious dialogue and Jewish modernity. Even left, the Christian left also at the time of the Cold War was also looking to recreate this discourse whereby religion would be maybe the antithesis to communism, or at least offer a social vision that could be constructive for a more just society. On the other hand, you also have, especially in the US, an evangelical movement that was dissatisfied with the ways in which Christianity, modern Christianity, was operating, and that actually there is a Benamozegh temple in San Antonio. So in Texas, you do have people who went back to the Noahide laws in order to promote a new understanding of Christianity. And where it becomes really interesting is that those people sort of join ranks with right-wing Zionists. And in this, unholy alliance where Christian Zionists and right-wing Zionists try to promote the Noahide laws for, various reasons. And like it's actually their own, they all have a dog in the race and they're pushing their own agenda, but like creating this union. And so you do have the far right party, the CARC party that was actually banned, that sort of reclaim Benamozegh's legacy in the sense that they try to use the Noahide laws in order to create a sort of second-rate citizenship for non-Jews. So the Noahide laws, when I mentioned that Benamozegh didn't see it as a kind of hierarchical, a tool to promote a hierarchy, well, in that case, there's certainly a notion that that's a possibility of theologically creating the foundation for a second-rate citizenship. And you see this, also as a sort of alternative to Rav Kook. How do you think about Judaism and the nation and the nations? And it's been taken up by some disturbing figures or used in circles that are, very surprisingly, or it's again, it is very disconcerting to see how someone who was so passionate about creating this condition for this religious unity be taken up or mobilized by such thinkers. And the reason why they say that Benamozegh was actually Christianized by Palier is that they go back to the text and they say, well, hold on a second. When Benamozegh talks about Adam, and he talks about Adam as this figure that contains whole of humanity, well, he stops, and that's the case actually, that he stops short of talking about the way in which in some Kabbalistic texts, Adam is only Israel, right? It's Adam that only means Israel. It doesn't mean humanity as a whole, just like this is only Israel is man, right? And so they're kind of continuing Benamozegh. So Benamozegh stops short of citing this passage, but they say that basically that would be where he's going, or something that he's hinting at, that he knows that people who are versed in Kabbalistic texts and would know that is actually you should look further, and that he's only scratching the surface, and that his message is not exactly what people what's on the paper. And so, and there is, various, and this is what I'm writing in the book, and it's sometimes a painful, or it is a conclusion that those texts that Benamozegh relied on or mobilized in order to promote this interreligious or that possibility of coexistence were written in times that where ethnocentrism was a no-brainer. Luriani Kabbalah really also has disturbing passages where non-Jews are not granted a soul. The soul is a bestial one, and so, non-Jews are like animals, and that's a fact. So the exercise that Benamozegh is proposing also raises questions as to how can we work with those texts that intrinsically have this capacity of or harbor some very ethnocentric passages in order to promote a different narrative and another modernity. That's something that I was shocked by, or that explains why I also was interested in having those. It's almost like a sort of the legacies. It's the second part of the book. There's another, there are also Benamozegh in unexpected places. He influenced his understanding of Kabbalah, influenced Lacan, who was the psychoanalyst who said that Israel and Humanity was the book he would have used to convert to Judaism had he converted. And also Modigliani, who was, in Livorno, and Benamozegh was the head of the Bar Mitzvah Commission. So that you can also claim that Modigliani's figures and this kind of blending of multiple identities and times would be a kind of universalism. And there is, Benamozegh's legacy in Livorno is also, you can see it as, it was a cradle and was a place, the birthplace of the Socialist Party that celebrated the 100th anniversary back like in January. And so that, that political message was also, that could have been taken that direction as well, this universalism and the necessity of coexistence. So, this is maybe a Rorschach test or a springboard to look at how, you can, how far you can go with texts, and then, how far people are, how people are resisting or not what is being advocated.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important and helpful, and brings us to some important questions about the potential of Benamozegh's thought for today, for people who are struggling with some of the same questions that he was struggling with. I want to make sure that we have time to get to our questions from the panel, from the participants. We have some questions already, which I will read. And then Clémence, you can respond, but I encourage people, there is time. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A and I can read it to Clémence. So our first question is from Ernest Gilman. And it's possible that Ernest, perhaps this has already been answered to some extent in the course of the conversation, but he asks, how is Kabbalah to be repurposed as an alternative to Jewish modernity?
All right, that's a fantastic question, and that's also something that Benamozegh was adamant about. So when you're thinking of about Jewish modernity, what comes to mind is Berlin and Mendelssohn and the idea that reason, Judaism as a religion of reason. And so for those people, Kabbalah is this kind of anathema of, this is the opposite of it is superstition, it is all kind of nonsense. And so that's something that Benamozegh didn't, this is a kind of Jewish modernity or modernity in general that he found to be very disturbing. There is something about Kabbalah that goes beyond reason, but that doesn't mean that it's irrational, right? There is, and this is exactly where the notion of the unconscious is so fundamental, and something that Freud and others will examine. If you're aware of the fact that there's something that escapes reason, or that goes beyond, then you're more attuned to what's there and like how that can connect us beyond this sort of also the worshiping. He also talks about kind of idol worshiping of reason, and being aware of the fact that everybody knows that the humans are not always operating upon reason, right? That's in an ideal world, or maybe not in an ideal world, but that's something which is not, imagining this is not actually so rational. And so he is basically offering that kind of other modernity in which reason would be an element of what brings humanity together, and that actually enables people to not operate along those binaries of faith versus science. His notion of progress is also extremely important. Basically what he's saying is that tradition is an instrument of progress, because tradition is, in his Kabbalistic understanding of tradition, is this progressive revelation. And so if you start with the premise that God, that Kabbalah or the scriptures are a kind of blueprint of creation, well, then science, is as a huge part to play in it, because it's just the way in which that revelation operates. And so there is going to be progress, is the progress of the mind. You know, it's like Condorcet, the idea that people are going to be able to improve and to get a better sense of that, the blueprint of creation. And that corresponds also to, you know, progressive revelation also corresponds to sort of progressive dissemination of Kabbalah. You have this tendency of, you know, Kabbalistic circles that try to, or actually not try, but who were functioning as initiates. And so Benamozegh knows that by disseminating or propagating those Kabbalistic concepts to wider audiences, that's something that can be almost a kind of heresy. But he's also saying that by doing this, you sort of bring greater awareness of what progress is about, and that maybe, you know, he has a moment towards the end of his life was like, maybe I'm hastening the coming of the Messiah. So, you know, there is this kind of messianic horizon that is not always so clear, but that becomes a kind of, not temptation, but a little more, he articulates it a little bit towards the end of his life. And, you know, the messianic times are also another question, you know, whether in the messianic times, this is going to be, you know, everybody is going to collapse into or converge into one. And so what is the place when we're talking about the universal and the particular, what is the place of the particular when everything gets merged in those messianic times? But he also sees this as this kind of a direction that his thought is taking. You know?
Yeah. No, that's great. I think that's really helpful. And the next question is also kind of posed with an eye towards making some of Benamozegh's thought relevant for very contemporary issues. This is Asher Vatatias, who asks, a wonderful prototype for interfaith dialogue before Vatican II and Pope John the 23rd's excision of Jewish guilt for the crucifixion, when such slander was widespread. Absolutely, that's true. And here's the question: how do I, survivor of the Holocaust of Greek Jewry, continue to lobby for such forthright change of dogma in Orthodox Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, this is, so in a way, those, I mean, Vatican II has a lot to, is indebted to this kind of way of creating the conditions for finding common grounds, and how do you, you know, how to sort of continue or use Benamozegh's concepts in those kind of conversations. I think that he has a very interesting concept that we didn't get to talk about. This is perfect time with a Q&A, which is the coincidence of opposites. So that's also something that he, you know, teases out from Kabbalah, and saying that on the surface, things might seem completely opposite, but there is the work that we need to do is to create this possibility of ascent to another state of reality. I mean, another way of understanding what seems to be at odds. And this is that coincidence of opposites, a place in which, again, like those binaries that we've, you know, tried to deconstruct, and it deconstructed, will not operate and will not be even relevant. And that's also the appeal of Benamozegh for someone like Lacan, who said that basically in the unconscious, there is no place for those oppositions. And this could be a way to capture both how dialogues can operate, but also how the mind itself operates, and the microcosm being an image of the macrocosm. And so that's something that is also divine, like this the principle of non-contradiction is something that is very important. All the more so as he also has another concept that is key, and that he, you know, takes from various Jewish traditions, but the imitation of God. So if God also has this place in which those contradictions don't hold, then we even more so have to be in the image of God and try to, through our work, through those engagements, really lift those contradictions. So you can say that there is something Hegelian of, in its mechanism, but he doesn't see this kind of synthesis as operative, because that synthesis still means that that there is the dynamics are lost, right? And there is something also that is very important in his work, which is you see this in the Kabbalistic tree, the emanations, right? The sphirot, something, the divine presence is not something that's static, it's something that's dynamic. And so thoughts and thought processes also have to be inscribed in this kind of dynamism. And this is, that can be this non-contradiction of, the coincidence of opposites, the dynamics of thought processes are also something that I think is important to keep in mind when, and especially in an age of, dissension, where, people inhabit their truth. And so there is no possibility of reaching across the aisle, or in a divisive world, the very possibility, or at least keeping that in mind, of maybe a place of I was going to say contagion, but contact is well, that's where it comes from. But it is something that we should not ignore, and that the possibility should, it should not be taken for granted that those oppositions are irreconcilable.
And also, you spoke about Benamozegh's interest in dialogue with Christian world during his lifetime and today. Could you mention something about the influence and context with Islam?
Right. So that's really interesting, because again, he came from this Moroccan family, and he has this, he actually spoke Arabic, and this is actually how we met Jessica, because you were asking about his handwriting, and so there is clear evidence that he was, aware of Muslim theology, but that's not what he decided to engage with. It fell to him, I guess, that so first of all, is writing for a Christian audience, or a European audience that would be, where Islam would be probably more of a distant presence. And he was also, he was participating in this Italian tradition of, Christian Jewish dialogue. He was still, he, again, with his work as a publisher, he was working with Moroccan, populating the people in Morocco. So he knew about Judeo-Arabic, and he knew Judeo-Arabic, but he did not really engage with Muslim theology. He has a little appendix at the end of Jewish and Christian ethics, where he talks a little bit about the shared origin of, it's more philology, and some, he was also writing at a time where that was very, the Orientalism and the science, and Jewish Orientalists dealing with Christianity there were not that many of them. You had Geiger, you had a couple of other thinkers, but that was not necessarily what he was, where he felt that the work was needed. And so, that could be, I wish he'd engaged more with Islam, all the more so as he had a, so he had a grudge against Lacan, and he was really offended by the notion that, by Orientalist notions. So basically he was saying that the Orient was a place in which those dichotomies that the Enlightenment had tried to push forward had never been relevant, and that that sort of clash between tradition and modernity was not was really a sort of byproduct of the European Enlightenment, and not the best thing. And so he also talks about how the Muslim, I mean, like, he talks about history and talks about how the Muslim presence had always meant that Jews could flourish. So he talks about the absence of ghetto in the Muslim world. And so he saw, he has very unkind words for Hasidism that he calls, Luzzatto also, they call them the black devils of Eastern Europe. But he says that basically nothing good came out of the ghetto and Jews being cut off from the world, and that actually the Orient had been was a counter example, and that, you know, for the longest periods, you know, looks, you know, ex-Oriented looks, right? The light came from the Orient. So that's something that he was adamant about. But Muslim theology is a blind spot.
You said he had a grudge against Lacan. You must have meant Renan.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay, good. Just making sure. And it's interesting, I mean, because in many ways, of course, he is. I mean, I don't know how much to make of this, but clearly he's writing against Renan in various ways, not just in terms of his much less horribly Orientalist and sort of, well, just frankly racist perception of the Orient, but also in terms of his vision of modernity and religion. And you know, I think I'll just note that the title of today's event is obviously close to the title of your book, but slightly different, The Future, Elia Benamozegh and the Future of Religion. And so I think it's appropriate to talk broadly about the implications of his thought for religion today.
Right, and also, I mean, that's something, the future of religion, or the religion of the future, is something that was actually very much a talk of the town, or like very much part of the conversation. I mentioned von Hartmann, who wrote and worked a lot on, I mean, really ushered in the for the general public the notion of collective unconscious that, you know, Nietzsche was so outraged by, saying, well, this is just that's a sort of practical joke, von Hartmann was also very preoccupied with the future of religion. He actually talked about the self-destruction of Christianity, and so Benamozegh was really worried that that could be, you know, some sort of prophecy that, that they could be, by abiding by the principles that the Vatican laid out in the Syllabus of Errors, that could be the self-destruction of religions and of Christianity. So, and again, from his point of view, that would mean that metaphysics, justice, all those things that he felt were part of the of a good society would be destroyed along the way.
In some ways, Benamozegh, I mean, he's talking about it in terms of religion, but in some ways he's making an argument for the essential, for the necessity of the humanities, right? We might put it in those terms today. We wouldn't necessarily limit it to religion, but in some ways it sounds like he's saying that all of these justice, beauty, truth, ethics, these come for him from a foundation of religion.
He's basically equating metaphysics and religion, and so if you take out metaphysics, according to him, which would be the result of you know, secularism, like an unexamined secularism winning, then it is really the loss of society as a whole, and even the collapse of what makes a social fabric possible.
Clémence, we're running out of time a little bit, but I just wanted to say that this is great, and we've covered a lot of his thought and what went into your book. But in researching, could you tell us briefly a little bit of what comes out in your reconstruction about his personal life? You know, one reads about, you know, the contrast between this towering intellectual figure and reports of his being so modest as an individual. Could you address this a little bit?
That's really interesting. He inhabits his books, right? So there is also something which is very traditional chacham. I mean, those people who actually you have to find them in their books. So when he gave so he never left Livorno. So his life was pretty uneventful, except that he talks about his son that he loved and lost. And he was very active in Italian politics for a while, up until the point where he was suspended from his work as a preacher because the Italian authorities, after when the Austrians came back, were unhappy with the propaganda. I mean, he was basically saying that he was using a soapbox, and so that is the more eventful. So he talks. There is a short biography. I mean, he never really wrote about his life. He wrote sometimes in the prefaces of books that he published. Like you have to go for those really short introductions to tease out a couple of details. But we know in his, he was asked to write an entry to the Encyclopedia of Jewish Thinkers that was published in Warsaw. And so that means that he was, you know, even though he's not so well known now, he was someone who mattered, even in Eastern Europe. And so he talks about his family coming, you know, from a very distinguished lineage of rabbis and judges. That his father came. His father had him at a very old age. That he had to take another wife because his first wife. So he took a younger wife and had someone pray in the Holy Land that he would beget an heir. And then he talks about the fact that he lost his father when he was 5, that he had to become an apprentice, that he hated it, that he was reading Spinoza instead of doing the accounting that he was required to do. And that actually that's how, and he talks about his loving mother and his uncle who taught him everything he had to know. And then he entered the seminary. And from that moment on, his life somehow is not, he doesn't record anything of significance. We know that he was, an active teacher. He published a few conferences. And that his students were extremely important. He was also complaining about the lack of dynamism of Jewish life in Livorno. But that's pretty much it. We also know that it took place in a trial that for the case Samama. I mean, a very important, a very well-known trial. At the time as an expert, and that's how he sort of made a little bit of money that helped his publishing house. But I mean, those are really small snippets. And one last aspect is that when Pallière came to visit him, he talked about the fact that Benamozegh seemed to be very aloof, and that he almost, so when he left him, they met at a hotel, or he sort of drifted away, and it was like this sage and this wise man who was not really fit for this world. So there's something about him being remote and a little bit disconnected from his surroundings. That doesn't, I mean, maybe it's a life of the mind, and it's really difficult. Like I'm thinking right now of the biopic of Hannah Arendt. Like, how do you render the life of the mind? That was well done, Margaret von Trotta, but there is it's challenging. So Yeah.
But as I said, inspiring, especially for these moments of forced isolation and limited mobility. Alessandro, it looks like we're about out of time. Is that?
Yes. So I would like to thank you very much both. Jessica, Marglin, thank you so much for conducting this. And Clémence, thank you for your book, your time, and thank for the audience for following this. And I hope to see you all in our next presentations. You can look at our website for upcoming events. And I really hope that we could present more programs on Benamozegh. This is a beautiful book and just a beginning. And there's so many aspects that we couldn't possibly cover in an hour and a half of this figure and of the book that Clémence Boulouque wrote. So really, thank you very much. And we'll see you very soon.
Thank you so much for doing this and for the invitation. And thank you,
Thank you to the audience.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you, Clémence. Yeah, thank you, Alessandro.
Okay.